On New Year's Eve, a lonely billionaire coup gets a call from the hospital. Hi, sir. You need to come as soon as possible. Your child was just born. Thinking it's a prank, he freezes in shock when the nurse enters. The mom's name Tristan Langley sat alone in the sprawling penthouse that crowned the city skyline, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand. The room was an ode to modern luxury, gleaming marble lowers floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the glittering city lights and art pieces, worth more than most people's homes. Yet the silence pressed down on him heavy and suffocating. It was New Year's Eve, but he had turned down every invitation to galas, private parties, and exclusive gatherings. His assistant had been baffled. You need to be seen, she said, her tone half pleading, half chiding. Tristan had shaken his head and muttered something about being too busy. The truth was far simpler. He didn't want to go because there was no one he truly wanted to be with. The world ended him. He knew. Billionaire by 35, a tech empire built from the ground up, and the kind of life most people dreamed of. Yet tonight, as laughter and celebration buzzed faintly from the streets below, Tristan felt nothing but an aching hollow. He glanced at the sleek clock mounted on the wall. 11:52 p.m. 8 minutes until midnight. 8 minutes until another year, another cycle of empty triumphs. His phone buzzed on the glass table beside him. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. Only a handful of people had this number, and none of them ever called for anything good, but the persistent hum of the vibration cut through the stillness, compelling him to pick up. Langley, he answered curtly, his voice tinged with weariness. Mr. Langley. The voice on the other end was female, gentle yet steady, carrying an undertone of urgency. This is Nurse Stevens from St. Mary's Hospital. I'm sorry to disturb you, but this is an urgent matter. Tristan straightened in his chair, confusion clouding his thoughts. I think you have the wrong number. No, sir, the nurse replied quickly. We have a newborn here, and the mother listed you as the other. She passed away during childbirth. Her words hit like a punch to the gut, momentarily stealing his breath. What are you talking about? He said, his voice sharp, almost angry. I don't have a child. Here must be some mistake. I understand this is shocking, sir, the nurse said calmly, though there was a note of sympathy in her tone. The mother named you in her final moments. We need you to come to the hospital as soon as possible. Tristan's mind raced, searching for any semblance of logic in what she was saying. What's the mother's name? Emily Parker, the nurse said after a brief pause. Emily, the nom. He landed like a stone in the pit of his stomach. He hadn't thought about her in years. They had dated briefly, months, really, but it had ended amicably, or so he thought. She had been kind, creative, and RLY different from anyone he met in his cutthroat world. He had admired her warmth, but had been too consumed by his ambitions to truly let her in. This can't be right, he said, the denial thick and high. Voice, Emily, and I haven't spoken in a long time. If this was true, she would have told me. She didn't have much time. The nurse interrupted gently. She made it clear that you're the father, sir. We need you to come here. The baby needs you. Tristan sank back into his chair, the room seeming to tilt around him. A baby, his baby. He couldn't reconcile the words with his reality. How could he, of all people, be a father? He had spent his life avoiding entanglements, building walls that no one could climb, and now out of nowhere he was being told he had a child. This has to be some kind of mistake, he muttered. Almas. To himself, I understand this is difficult to process, the nurse said patiently, but the child needs immediate care and a legal guardian. Please come to the hospital. Bring identification. We'll explain a very thing when you arrive. Tristan's grip tightened on the phone. His first instinct was to refuse to shut this down as a misunderstanding and go back to his life, but something in the nurse's tone, the urgency, the quiet plea, stopped him. He thought of Emily, her kind smile, and the way she used to look at him, as if she saw something more than the ruthless seal he presented to the world. Could she really have been carrying his child all this time without telling him? Fine, he said the word heavy with reluctance. I'll be there. The nurse thanked him and hung up. Tristan sat motionless for a moment, the silent sea of the room now oppressive. He set the phone down and rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of the chaos suddenly thrust into his orderly existence. He rose from the chair and walked to the massive windows looking out at the city. Fireworks had begun to burst in the distance, their vibrant colors painting the night sky. He watched them in silence, their celebratory energy of stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside him. After a moment, he turned away and grabbed his coat. His sleek black car waited in the private garage below, but for once he didn't feel the usual satisfaction of the effortless luxury it represented as led into the hospital parking lot. The weight of the Situation fully settled on his shoulders, he didn't know what awaited him inside an infinite piece of himself he never knew existed into reality he wasn't sure he was ready to face, but for the first time in years Tristan Langley felt something other than emptiness. It was fear, yes, but also the faintest spark of something else, something that felt a lot like hope. Tristan stepped into the dimly lit hospital court corridor, the sterile smell of disinfectant stinging his senses, the quiet hum of machines and muffled voices echoed faintly, a stark contrast to the celebratory chaos he had just driven through. Fireworks had lit up the night sky as he made his way across the city, each explosion of color only deepening his sense of unease. Now, standing under the harsh fluorescent lights, he felt the weight of reality pressing down on him. A nurse approached him, her expression professional but tinged with sympathy. "Mr. Langley?" she asked softly. Tristan nodded at his throat dry. He had spent the drive convincing himself this was a mistake, that somehow this was a mix-up, but the look in her eyes told him otherwise. "Follow me," she said, her voice calm but firm. She led him through a maze of hallways until they reached a small, quiet office. She gestured for him to sit, then handed him a sealed envelope. "This is from Emily Parker," she said. "She asked that you receive it if something happened to her." Tristan stared at the envelope, his name written in Emily's familiar handwriting. For a moment, he couldn't move his hands, so steady in boardrooms and negotiations. Now, trembled as he reached out to take it. The nurse gave him a moment of privacy, slipping out of the room with a promise to return shortly. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter, his breath catching as he recognized her words, so uniquely Emily, thoughtful, heartfelt, and unflinchingly honest. "Dear Tristan, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer here." Writing those words feels surreal, but I knew I had to prepare for the possibility. "There's so much I want to say, but I'll try to keep it simple. First, I want you to know that I didn't keep our child from you out of spite or secrecy. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to burden you. I saw the weight you carried, the empire you were building, the walls you surrounded yourself with, and I thought giving you this news might only make it harder for you. But as I carried our daughter, I realized how wrong I was. I thought about you every day, Tristan. I thought about how kind you could be when you let your guard down, how much passion you poured into what you cared about, and how I saw glimpses of a man who could love deeply even if he didn't realize it himself. Her name is LLA. I chose it because of means play in some languages, and I want her to have a life full of joy and laughter, but she also needs stability, love, and someone to guide her. That's why I named you, because no matter how much I doubted myself, I never doubted you. Please take care of her, Tristan. She's part of you, part of us, and I believe she'll be the best thing that ever happens to you. With love, always, Emily." Tristan lowered the letter, his chest tight. He hadn't cried in years, decades, maybe, but now his vision blurred, and he had to steady himself against the table. Her words echoed in his mind, each one pulling him deeper into a whirlwind of emotions he couldn't begin to untangle. The end. Urs returned, her presence grounding him. "Are you ready to meet her?" she asked gently. He hesitated, but nodded. His legs felt like lead as he followed her down another hallway, every step bringing him closer to a truth he wasn't sure he could handle. When they reached the neonatal unit, the nurse stopped in front of a large window. Inside, rows of tiny cribs lined the room, each holding a fragile new life. He pointed to one near the corner. "That's her," she said. Tristan stepped closer, his breath catching there. She was a tiny bundle swaddled in pink, her features delicate and impossibly small, her dark hair curled softly against her forehead, and her face held an expression of peaceful oblivion. His instinct was to step back, to retreat to the safety of denial. This couldn't be real. How could something small and vulnerable possibly belong to him? But as he stood there, he felt an inexplicable pull, a magnetic connection that rooted him to the spot. The nurse must have sensed his hesitation. "You can't hold her if you'd like," she said. His voice cracked and he cleared his throat. "I don't know how that's okay," she said with a reassuring smile. "I'll show you." Moments later, Tristan was sitting in a rocking chair, the nurse gently placing LLA in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, yet he felt as though the universe itself had shifted in that moment. Her tiny hand peeked out from the blanket, her fingers curling reflexively. He reached out hesitantly, and when her hand closed around his finger, something inside him broke open. "She's perfect," he whispered, the words tumbling out unbidden. The nurse smiled. "She's been waiting for you." As he rocked her gently, Tristan's thoughts drifted back to the letter, to Emily's belief in him. He wasn't ready for this. How could he be? His life was a fortress of ambition and Troll and Leia represented everything he had spent. Years avoiding vulnerability, chaos, and connection, yet here, she was demanding. Nothing but the love he wasn't sure he knew how to give. He looked down at her. Her tiny features so impossibly innocent, and felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took his breath away. Emily had carried this secret, this responsibility. Without him, she had faced her fears alone, and how she was gone. I'm sorry, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't. No. Lila stirred slightly, her lips parting in a tiny yawn, and the brought an unexpected smile to his face for the first time. In what felt like forever, he allowed himself to feel something beyond guilt and fear. It wasn't confidence exactly, but it was enough, a flicker of hope, just as Emily had written. The nurse stepped forward. Breaking the silence. We'll need to go over some paperwork, but for now, just take your time with her. Tristan nodded, his gaze never leaving Lila. He didn't know how he was going to do this or what kin. A father he could be. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away, not from her, not now. Emily had seen something in him, a capacity for love and care he had long buried, and as he held LLA, he wondered if she had been right all along. Tristan sat in the hospital chair, Lila still cradled in his arms. The world outside the window was slowly brightening, the first rays of dawn casting a soft glow over the city. He hadn't moved in what felt like hours, unable to tear his eyes away from the fragile life resting against his chest. Everything about her was impossibly small, her fingers, her nose, the delicate wrists and fall of her chest as she slept. He was struck by how vulnerable she looked, her tiny body swaddled in pink, so new to the world that she didn't even know her mother was gone. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment he felt as if he couldn't breathe. How could he possibly fill the void that Em had left behind? How could he be enough? The nurse had returned earlier, quietly handing him a birth certificate form. He stared at the blank space where the baby's name should go, unable to bring himself to write anything down. It felt too monumental, too final. Instead, he had clung to the one tangible connection. He had left the letter Emily had written him. Her words echoed in his mind, each one a plea, not just for her daughter's future, but for his own. The weight of responsibility was immense, and yet there was something else, a strange, unexpected warmth. He hadn't felt it at first, not in the chaotic whirlwind of the call or the shock of hearing Emily's name, but now as LLA shifted sly TY in his arms, her tiny fingers brushing against his chest, he felt it, a connection. It was faint, like the first flicker of a flame, but it was there, steady and undeniable. A soft knock at the door. Enter. Rupeed upped his thoughts. The nurse stepped in, her smile kind but professional. Mr. Langley, would you like me to take her back to the nursery so you can get some rest? She asked. Tristan shook his head, immediately surprising even himself. No, I'm fine, he said quickly. I'd like to keep her with me for a little longer. The nurse nodded, clearly accustomed to new parents reluctant to let their babies out of I take all the time you need, she said before stepping out again. He looked down at LLA, who had stirred slightly at the sound of the door, her tiny face scrunched up for a moment before relaxing again, her mouth forming a perfect little "oh." He couldn't help but smile, the tension in his chest easing just a fraction. Lila, he murmured, testing the name aloud. It felt right, just as Emily had said playfully. GHT, a promise of joy, but it needed something more, a connection to the woman who had brought her into the world and entrusted her to him. LLA, Emily Langley, he said softly, the words carrying a weight he hadn't expected. His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat, holding her closer. That's your name, you're Lila. Emily, the act of naming her felt strangely transformative. It was a declaration, a calm. It meant a recognition that she wasn't just a baby in his arms, she was his daughter, she was his responsibility now. And no amount of fear or self-doubt could change that. For the first time, Tristan allowed himself to truly look at her, taking in every detail, her tiny hands, the wisps of dark hair curling against her forehead, the delicate curve of her cheek. She was so small, so utterly dependent on him, and yet there was something powerful about her presence. She didn't know who he was, didn't care about his wealth or his achievements. All she needed was someone to hold her, to keep her safe. I'm not Sue. I'm the right man for the job, he admitted quietly, his voice trembling, but I'll try. I promise I'll try. LLA stirred again, her tiny hand breaking free of the blanket. Her fingers curled and uncurled, and Tristan hesitantly reached out, his much larger hand hovering above hers. When her fingers closed around his, gripping with surprising strength, he felt something shift deep within him. It wasn't a drama, tick transformation, or a sudden epiphany, but a quiet, steady realization She was his, and for the first time in his life that terrified him more than anything else. He sat there for a while longer, rocking her gently as the morning light filled the room. He thought of Emily, of the brief months they had spent together. She had been so different from anyone else he had ever dated, kind, grounded, unafraid to see challenge him. He had ended things because he hadn't seen a place for her in his world, and now he wondered if that had been his greatest mistake. The door opened again, this time admitting a different Nur SE with a clipboard. She smiled at him, her eyes warm as she took in the scene. "How's she doing?" she asked softly. "She's perfect," Tristan replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. The nurse nodded. "That's what we like to hear. I just need to go over a few things with you. Paperwork, discharge procedures, things like that. Do you have someone you'd like to call, a partner or family member who CA and help?" The question caught him off guard. His mind immediately went to his assistant, to his colleagues, to the network of people who managed every aspect of his life, but none of them were family. None of them were Emily. "No," he said after a moment. "It's just me." The nurse didn't press, instead guiding him through the process with practiced deficiency. Tristan listened, his mind only half absorbing the detail, as he kept one hand on Lila's blanket the entire time, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. By the time they finished, the weight of the situation had settled fully on his shoulders. He had named her, held her, promised her a life he wasn't sure he could provide, but there was no going back now. This was his reality, and for better or worse, he was determined to face it. As the nurse left, Tristan Ked down at LL. And once more she had fallen asleep again, her tiny face peaceful and serene. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted softly, his voice barely a whisper, "but I'll figure it out for you. I'll figure it out." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, the gesture awkward and unfamiliar, but full of meaning. The flame of connection he had felt earlier was growing stronger, now filling the empty space. Wit in him. LLA Emily Langley wasn't just his daughter, she was his chance to be something more, to build a life that mattered. Tristan stood in the nursery, rocking LLA gently in his arms as the faint glow of an eye illuminated the room. The apartment, once stark and clinical, had undergone a transformation in the weeks since he had brought her home. The cold and personal lines of his penthouse were softened, and now with pastel accents, a crib by the window, shelves stacked with baby books, and a mobile hanging overhead that spun slowly in the dim light. Despite the changes, the sense of chaos was overwhelming. Nothing in Tristan's meticulously ordered world had prepared him for the whirlwind of fatherhood. His days, once a seamless schedule of meetings, emails, and strategic decisions, were now punctuated by CRIES feedings and diaper changes. The nights were even harder, leaving him sleepless and uncertain. He had thought hiring ING help would ease the transition. The nanny, an experienced woman named Karen, had arrived within hours of his call. She had been efficient and kind, immediately taking charge and teaching him the basics of caring for Lila. But the more he watched her care for his daughter, the more he felt like an outsider, a bystander in his own child's life. Tristan had always been good at delegating, trusting his team to execute his vision, but this parenthood felt different. LLA wasn't a project or a quarterly goal. She needed more than the structured systems and problem-solving strategies that had built his empire. She needed him. One evening, after Karen had gently suggested he take a break, Tristan found himself sitting alone in his office, staring at an old photograph of his parents. His father's stern face loomed in his memory, a man who had rarely smiled and never offered a word of praise. Tristan's childhood had been defined by cold expectations, every interaction a transaction rather than an expression of love. He had vowed never to be like his father, but now, holding Lila's future in his hand, as he feared he might repeat the same mistakes. What if he wasn't capable of giving her what she needed? What if his own brokenness seeped into her life, shaping her in ways he couldn't undo? Lila's cry up the air, pulling him from his thoughts. He rushed to the nursery, his heart pounding. Karen wasn't scheduled to arrive until the morning, and the responsibility of calming her fell squarely on his shoulders. When he reached her crib, she was kicking her tiny legs, her face red and scrunched in distress. He scooped her up, his movements still awkward, but improving with practice. Her cries didn't subside immediately, and a wave of panic surged through him. "It's okay," he murmured, rocking her gently. "I've got you. I'll figure this out." Her wall softened, though tears still strewed her cheeks. Tristan settled into the chair by the crib, holding her close and letting her tiny hand clutch his finger. The touch was grounding, a reminder that despite his doubts, he was here, he was trying. The hours turned into days, and Slowly, Tristan began to find a rhythm. He learned how to distinguish her cries, hunger, discomfort, exhaustion, and how to soothe her in ways that worked. Karen remained a steady presence, but Tristan made a conscious effort to take the lead. He was there for the feedings, the sleepless nights, the quiet moments when LLA would gaze up at him with wide, curious eyes. Yet even as he adjusted, the doubts linger. One evening, after finally getting Lila to sleep, Tristan sank onto the couch and let his head fall into his hands, the weight of it all pressed down on him, an endless tide of questions and fears. Was he doing enough? Was he good enough? He thought of Emily's letter, her unwavering belief in his capacity to love and care for their daughter. She had seen something in him that he struggled to see in himself. But what if she had been wrong? What if he let LLA down the way his father had let him down? The sound of tiny coos pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see LLA in her crib, stirring in her sleep but not yet waking. Her face was peaceful, her little fingers curling around the edge of her blanket. She was so small, so innocent, and yet she had already changed his world in ways he couldn't have imagined. Tristan stood and walked over to her crib, gazing down at her. He thought about his father again, about the long stretches of silence and the heavy weight of expectations that had defined his childhood. He thought about the boy he had been yearning for, a kind word or a moment of connection that never came. "I won't do that to you," he whispered. "I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out. You deserve better." He reached down and gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. The promise felt heavy, but it also felt right. LLA deserved more than he had been given, and for her he was willing to try. Why the weeks turned into a blur of first smiles, first attempts at holding her head up, first moments where Tristan felt the faintest glimmers of confidence. Each milestone, no matter how small, felt like a victory. But there were setbacks too, nights when nothing seemed to calm her, days when he felt the crushing weight of his own inadequacies. Still, he pressed on. He started reading parenting books, in the late hours of the night, seeking advice and guidance wherever he could find it. He reached out to an old friend, a father of 3, and listened as he recounted his own struggles and triumphs bit by bit. Tristan began to believe that he could do this, that he could be the father LLA needed. One afternoon, while LLA napped in her crib, Tristan stood in the living room and stared at a stack of files on the table. Work. It had been weeks since he had stepped into his office, delegating everything to his team while he focused on LLA. The thought of returning to that world felt distant, almost foreign. For why? Years his work had defined him, filling the empty spaces inside him with purpose and accomplishment. But now, as he looked at the files, he realized something had shifted. LLA had filled those spaces in a way that no achievement ever could. He turned away from the files and walked back to the nursery. Sitting beside her crib, he watched her sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. She was his world now, his reason for trying, his reason for believing he could be better. And for the first time, the weight of responsibility didn't feel so heavy. It felt like love. The days began to take on YHM an imperfect but comforting cadence as Tristan settled into his new role as a father. There were moments of chaos, of course, nights when LLA refused to sleep, mornings when he couldn't seem to get her to stop crying. But there were also moments of quiet triumph. He was learning slowly but surely how to care for her. He had started to recognize the little cues that signaled her needs, the hungry cry, the sleepy whimper, the way her tiny fists curled when she was frustrated, and with every successful feeding, every calm moment after a fit of tears, he felt a small spark of pride. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. One morning, as the soft light of dawn filtered through the nursery window, Tristan sat with Lila and almost smiled. Suddenly, she let out a soft gurgle, her face lighting up with something that could only be described as joy. It was her first real smile, and Tristan's breath caught. He froze, unsure if he'd imagined it, but then she did it again, her lips curling. Rush of emotion, a mixture of joy and disbelief. She was still so small, so new to the world, yet in that tiny smile, Tristan saw the beginnings of a bond he hadn't been sure he could form. He Ned forward, pressing a kiss to her forehead, his heart swelling in a way he hadn't thought possible. Moments like these made the sleepless nights and constant self-doubt worth it. They gave him the strength to keep going even when the challenges seemed insurmountable. But as he grew closer to LLA, Tristan couldn't ignore the growing divide between his new life and the one he had built before her. His calm Penny had been his entire world for years, a relentless pursuit of success that left little room for anything else. But now, as he watched Layla's tiny milestones, her first laugh, her fascination with the colorful mobile Above her crib, he found himself questioning everything. What was the point of all his accomplishments if he couldn't be present for these moments, if he missed the chance to watch his daughter grow? It wasn't an easy decision. But Tristan began to step back from his role as CEO. He delegated responsibilities to his most trusted colleagues, ensuring the company would continue to thrive. In his absence, there were objections, of course, investors who questioned his priorities, board members who doubted his commitment, but Tristan stood firm. For the first time in his life, work came second. Instead of 12-hour days in the office, he spent his mornings with Lila, reading to her, feeding her, simply being with her. In the afternoons, he worked from home, carving out hours for calls and meetings while still keeping her close. It was a delicate balance, and there were times when it felt like he was failing at both, but he knew he was doing the right thing. Yet, even as he poured himself into fatherhood, here was a part of him that remained unresolved, a part that couldn't stop thinking about Emily. Her absence loomed over everything, a quiet reminder of the life they could have shared, the family they all have been. One crisp autumn afternoon, Tristan decided it was time to face that lingering grief. He dressed Lila warmly and drove to the cemetery where Emily was buried. The air was cool and still, the trees above casting long shadows across the ground. He carried Lila in his arms as he approached the simple gravestone, its inscription a bittersweet reminder of the woman he had lost. For a long moment, he stood there in silence, unsure of what to say. The last time he had seen Emily, they had parted on good terms, but there had been no indication of what lay ahead, no way of knowing that their paths will intersect again in this way. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know if I'd known I would have been there." His throat tightened, and he looked down at Lila, who was gazing up at him with her wide, innocent eyes. "She's beautiful, Emily," he said, his voice breaking. "She's perfect. You were right about her, about me." He sank down onto the grass, holding Lila close as he spoke. He told Emily about the sleepless nights, the tiny triumphs, the way Lila's smile had changed him in ways he hadn't thought possible. He apologized for the years they had lost, for not being the man she had believed he could be sooner. "I promise I'll do right by her," he said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "I'll give her the life you wanted for her. I'll make sure she knows how much you loved her." The wind rustled gently through the trees, and for a moment Tristan felt a sense of peace. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the choices that had led them here, but he could honor Emily's memory by being the father Lila deserved. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden light across the cemetery, Tristan stood and kissed his fingertips before pressing them to Emily's gravestone. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." He turned and walked back to the car. Lila nestled against his chest. She had fallen asleep, her tiny hand clutching the fabric of his jacket. Tristan looked down at her and smiled, the weight of grief still present but no longer overwhelming. Driving home, he felt a quiet determination settle over him. This was his life now, messy and imperfect, but full of purpose. Lila had given him something he hadn't even realized he was missing, a reason to believe in himself, a reason to keep going. As they reached the apartment and Tristan carried her inside, he glanced around the space that had once felt so empty. It wasn't just his home anymore, it was Lila's too, and together they were building something new, something that mattered. For the first time in a long time, Tristan felt whole. The quiet routine Tristan had worked so hard to establish was shattered one morning when his phone buzzed incessantly on the kitchen counter. Lila was strapped into her high chair, happily babbling as she squished pureed carrots between her fingers. Tristan had just turned to grab a paper towel when the alert caught his eye. He unlocked the screen, his stomach dropping. The headlines splashed across a popular gossip site: "Billionaire Tristan Langley's secret baby. Who's the mother?" Below, it was a grainy photo of him carrying Lila in the park, her face partially hidden, but unmistakably visible. A knot of dread coiled in his chest as he skimmed the article, which was riddled with speculation and invasive details about his private life. His first instinct was to shield Lila, to protect her from the prying eyes of a world that would never understand what she meant to him. The media had always been a part of his life, a necessary evil he had learned to tolerate, but this felt different. This wasn't about him, it was about her, an innocent baby who deserved none of this scrutiny. Tristan called his public relations team, his voice tight with anger, as he instructed them to do everything in their power to mitigate the story. But even as they assured him they'd handle it, he knew there was only so much they could do. The story was out there, and the vultures would circle over the next few days. The press intrusion Grew worse. Paparazzi camped outside his building, their cameras flashing every time he stepped out. He started taking LLA to parks and activities in the early hours of the morning, hoping to avoid the crowds, but it was a temporary fix at best. He could see the questions in people's eyes, hear the murmurs as strangers whispered about him and his daughter one evening. As he sat in the nursery rocking LLA to sleep, the weight of it all pressed down on him. He looked at her peaceful face, her tiny hand resting against his chest, and felt a surge of protectiveness unlike nothing he'd ever known. "I'm not going to let them hurt you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't care what it costs me." The next day, he took a drastic step. He reached out to his legal team to secure stronger privacy measures, ensuring that anyone who published photos of LLA would face severe consequences. He also made the difficult decision to address the rumors head-on, releasing a careful, worded statement about his commitment to his daughter and his desire for her to grow up away from the public eye. The backlash was immediate. Some accused him of hiding. Others praised his decision. Tristan didn't care. His only priority was LLA, and he would do whatever it took to protect her. Still, the ordeal left him feeling isolated. For years, he had relied on his ability to compartmentalize, to handle challenges on his own without leaning on anyone. But now, with Lila's well-being at stake, he realized he couldn't do this alone. Reluctantly, he began to reach out to people he had drifted away from. He called his college friend Marcus, who had 2 young kids of his own, and spent hours on the phone asking for advice about everything from sleep schedules to toddler tantrums. He reconnected with his younger sister Clara, who had always been the more nurturing one in the family. She immediately offered to come visit, bringing a warmth and familiarity that Tristan hadn't realized how much he missed. Era arrived a few days later, her arms full of gifts for Lila and her face lit with excitement. As soon as she saw her niece, she melted, scooping the baby into her arms and cooing at her with a joy that made Tristan's heart ache. "She's perfect, Tristan," Clara said, her voice soft as she rocked LLA. "You're doing a good job. I can see it." Her words brought a lump to his throat. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear them, how much he had doubted himself. Despite all his efforts with Clara's help, the apartment felt less like a fortress and more like a home. She cooked meals, offered parenting tips, and NT hours playing with Lila, giving Tristan a chance to breathe. Her presence reminded him of what it meant to have a support system, something he had pushed away for so long in his pursuit of success. But even as he leaned on Clara and Marcus, Tristan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more work to be done within himself. He had spent his entire life building walls, and while LLA had managed to eke through them, he knew those barriers still lingered, threatening to hold him back. One evening, after putting LLA to bed, Tristan made a decision. He sat down at his desk and searched for a therapist, who could help him untangle the mess of emotions he had buried for years. It wasn't an easy step. Admitting he needed help felt like a vulnerability he wasn't used to, but he knew it was necessary. The first session was awkward. Tristan fumbled over his words, unsure how to articulate what he was feeling, but as the sessions continued, he began to open up. He talked about his father, about the cold stance that had defined their relationship, and the fear that he might repeat those patterns with LLA. He talked about Emily, about the guilt and grief that still lingered despite his efforts to move forward through it all. The therapist listened, offering gentle guidance and helping him see the progress he was making, even if it felt slow. Each session felt like peeling back another layer, exposing wound as he had long ignored but was finally ready to heal. As the weeks passed, Tristan noticed subtle changes in himself. He felt lighter, more present. The fear that had once paralyzed him began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence in his ability to be the father LLA needed. One night, as he sat in the living room with Lila asleep in his arms, Tristan reflected on how far they had come. The challenges hadn't disappeared. There were still sleepless nights, public scrutiny, and moments of doubt, but he no longer felt like he was facing them alone. He had LLA, Clara, Marcus, and even himself, a version of himself. For the first time, he felt not just like a protector or a provider, but like a father, and in that he found a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was searching for. Tristan sat on the living room floor, surrounded by scattered blocks and stuffed animals, as LLA let out a peal of laughter. Her tiny hands clapped together, her face lit with pure joy as she toppled a tower of colorful blocks he'd painstakingly built just for her to destroy. He laughed, too unable to help himself. Her giggles were infectious, a sound that filled every corner of the once sterile penthouse. The transformation of his home mirror And the one happening in his heart gone were the austere minimalist furnishings and the cold, detached atmosphere. Now the space was alive with color and warmth. Lila's nursery was the crown jewel, a cozy sanctuary painted in soft pastels, filled with plush animals, books, and a crib adorned with a handmade mobile. Tristan had spent hours assembling it himself, determined to make it perfect. The rest of the Who's had followed suit. Framed photos of LLA adorned the walls, capturing her first smile, her first attempts at crawling, and moments of quiet connection between them. Toys and baby gear were scattered across the living room, and a soft rug replaced the hard marble floor to give LLA a safe place to play. It was messy, chaotic, and utterly unlike the life Tristan had once lived, but he wouldn't have it any other way. As LLA crawled toward him, babbling in her own language, Tristan scooped her up and planted a kiss on her chubby cheek. She squealed in delight, wrapping her tiny arms around his neck. These moments were everything. They made the sleepless nights, the constant juggling of work and parenting, and the lingering challenges worth it. A few months later, Tristan decided to mark a milestone of his own. For years he had avoided celebrating his birthday, dismissing it as just another day, but now with Lila in his life, he felt differently. She had given him a reason to celebrate, a reminder that life was worth cherishing. He planned a small gathering, inviting Clara, Marcus, and a handful of close friends who had become a part of Lila's world. The night of the party, the penthouse was filled with the hum of conversation and the sound of laughter. Tristan had transformed the dining area into a cozy, inviting space with fairy lights strung across the windows and a table set with simple, thoughtful touches. LLAD rest in an adorable floral dress that Clara had picked out was the center of attention. She toddled between guests, her steps wobbly but determined, and charmed everyone with her curious gaze and why smiles. Tristan watched her with a sense of pride and wonder, still amazed by how much she had changed his life. As the evening wore on, Clara raised a toast to Tristan. She said, her voice warm and affectionate, for finding joy in the unexpected, for embracing fatherhood with a full heart, and for showing us all that second chances can lead to the most beautiful things. Tristan felt his chest tighten, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He glanced at LLA, who was busy trying to grab a handful of cake from his plate, and smiled. Delilah, he said, raising his glass, for teaching me what it means to truly lie. The room erupted in cheers, and for the first time in years, Tristan felt a sense of belonging. This wasn't just his home anymore. It was a place filled with love, laughter, and the people who mattered most. In the weeks that followed, Tristan found himself thinking about Emily more. Often her absence was still a quiet ache, but it no longer felt like an open wound. Instead, it was a gentle reminder of the life they could have shared and the promise he had made to honor her memory. Inspired by her letter and the love she had for Lila, Tristan began to envision a way to give back. He remembered how strong and independent Emily had been, how she had faced pregnancy and motherhood alone, and how many others might be in similar situations without the support they needed. That thought grew into an idea, and the idea became a plan. Tristan decided to create a foundation in Emily's name, one dedicated to supporting single parents and children in need. The foundation would provide financial assistance, healthcare, resources, and access to education and job training, everything Emily might have wanted for herself. And LLA launching the foundation was a labor of love. Tristan poured himself into the work, meeting with experts, assembling a team, and personally funding the initial programs. For the first time, his wealth felt like more than just a number. It was a tool to create real, meaningful change. At the official launch event, Tristan stood on stage with Lila in his arms. The audience was a mix of colleagues, partners, and beneficiaries of the foundation, their faces filled with anticipation and gratitude. Tristan took a deep breath, his heart pounding, and began to speak. This foundation is more than just a name, he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. It's a promise to honor someone who believed in love and resilience, even in the face of challenges. Emily Parker was the kind of person who inspired hope, and it's my privilege to carry that hope forward through this work. He glanced down at LL, who was playing with the microphone cord, oblivious to the significance of the moment. And it's for her, he continued, his voice softening, for my daughter LLA, who has shown me the importance of family connection and of creating a world where every child has the chance to thrive. The room erupted in applause, and Tristan felt a wave of pride and gratitude wash over him. This wasn't just a tribute to Emily or a gift for LLA, it was a new chapter in his life, one that reflected the man he was becoming. As the event wound down and Tristan mingled with the attendees, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known was possible. He wasn't just building a better life for Lila, he was building a legacy, one rooted in love, compassion, and second chances. That night, as he tucked LLA into bed, Tristan sat beside her crib and whispered a quiet promise. We're building something beautiful, Lila, for you, for your mom, and for everyone who needs a little hope. Thank you for showing me the way. LLA stirred in her sleep, her tiny hand reaching out as if to grasp the words he had spoken. Tristan smiled, leaning down to kiss her forehead. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. The snow fell gently outside the windows, blanketing the city in a pristine glow. Tristan stood in the living room of his transformed penthouse, a steaming mug of cocoa in his hand. Lila sat nearby on the plush rug, stacking blocks with the intense focus only a toddler could muster. She babbled to herself, her little voice filling the room with a melody of innocence and wonder. It was New Year's Eve, exactly 1 year since his life had been irrevocably changed by a phone call that shattered his carefully constructed world. Tristan let out a soft breath, watching the condensation form on the window as he gazed at the city lights below. A year ago, this same view had felt cold and isolating, the height of his success, doing little to fill the void in his heart. Now the same view felt alive, a backdrop to the warmth and joy that LLA had brought into his life. He set his mug down and joined her on the floor, sitting cross-legged. As she turned to him with a wide grin, her tiny hand reached out, offering him one of the blocks. She exclaimed triumphantly. Tristan's heart swelled. The first time she had called him he had barely held back tears. It was a simple word, but it carried a meaning so profound that he couldn't help but marvel at how much she had changed him. Thank you, sweetheart, he said, taking the block and adding it to her growing tower. She giggled, knocking it over in delight, and his sound filled him with a happiness he hadn't known he could feel. As the clock inched closer to midnight, Clara arrived with a bottle of sparkling cider and a plate of homemade cookies. She greeted LLA with her usual exuberance, scooping her up and twirling her around, much to the toddler's delight. Marcus arrived soon after, his 2 kids in tow, and the penthouse came alive with laughter, chatter, and happy chaos of family. Tristan watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of pride. This wasn't just a home, it was a haven, a place where love and connection thrived. He had spent so many years chasing success, building an empire, and yet it was in these small, messy moments that he had found his true purpose. As the countdown to midnight began, everyone gathered in the living room. Clara handed Lila back to Tristan, and he held her close, her small body warm against his chest. She was getting bigger now, her chubby legs strong and determined as she practiced walking with increasing confidence. 5, 4, 3, the group chanted, the excitement building. Just as they reached one, Layla squirmed in his arms, her eyes bright with determination. She wriggled free and took a wobbly step forward, then another. Tristan froze, his breath caught in his throat as he watched her take her first unassisted steps. She's walking, Clara exclaimed, clapping her hands in delight. Tristan's heart felt like it might burst. He crouched down, arms outstretched, and Lila toddled toward him, her movements uncertain but filled with the kind of courage that only a child could possess. When she finally fell into his arms, he held her tight, his chest teeming with emotion. You did it, he whispered, his voice thick with pride. You're amazing, LL. The fireworks outside erupted into a kaleidoscope of color, their vibrant explosions lighting up the night sky. Tristan turned toward the window, still holding LLA, and together they watched the dazzling display. She clapped her hands in wonder, her face alight with pure joy. In that moment, Tristan felt a quiet stillness settle over him. The past year had been one of transformation, filled with challenges, growth, and moments that had tested him in ways he hadn't thought possible yet. Standing there with LLA in his RMS, he realized that every struggle, every doubt, and every tear had been worth it. You changed everything, you know, that he murmured to her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. A year ago, I didn't even know what I was missing, and now I can't imagine life without you. She turned to him with a gummy smile, as if she understood every word. Tristan chuckled, his heart so full it felt like it might overflow. Clara came up beside him, her eyes soft as she looked at the two of them. You're a great dad, Tristan, she said quietly. Emily would be so proud. Tristan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He still What about Emily often, especially during moments like this when her absence was felt as strongly as her presence in Leia's smile or the shape of her little hands, but instead of sadness, there was now a sense of gratitude, a deep appreciation for the gift she had given him, the love she had entrusted him with. As the fireworks continued to light up the sky, Tristan held Layla close and whispered, "Omi's as he intended to keep for the rest of his life. I'll always protect you," he said softly. "I'll always be here for you no matter what." The noise of the party swirled around him, but for Tristan time meant to slow. He gazed out at the city, the reflections of the fireworks shimmering in the glass, and felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. This was his life now, messy, unpredictable, and filled with more love than he had ever thought possible. LLA had shown him the beauty of second chances, the power of connection, and the importance of finding joy in the unexpected. As the final fireworks burst in a dazzling display of light, Tristan looked at LLA, her tiny face filled with wonder, and smiled. He had found his purpose, his reason for being, and it had been right here all along, waiting for him to see. Yet life's greatest treasures, he realized, often come from the most unexpected places. As the fireworks fade and the night quiets down, Tristan's story reminds us all of an important truth. Life's greatest treasures often come from the most unexpected places. In the span of a single year, he went from a man consumed by ambition and loneliness to a father transformed by love, purpose, and hope. Through the challenges and triumphs, Tristan discovered that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or success. It's found in the bonds we share, the lives we touch, and the moments we cherish. So what about you? You ever faced an unexpected moment that completely changed your perspective on life? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you for watching, and here's to finding joy in the unexpected. See you in the next video.